Okay, so I want to talk about Ernest Hemingway's short story, Hills Like White Elephants. So, Hemingway, of course, has this tremendous reputation as, if not the greatest, maybe the most popular 20th century American writer. Uh, Almost certainly in a global sense. Hugely popular. And we're not particularly interested in his reputation. His reputation ebbs and flows. There are some people who view him in a very positive light and some who view him in a very negative light. Um, there are certainly elements of his personal character that are maybe dated and challenging to us now in the as we enter into the third decade of the 21st century. But what we're particularly interested in here is his style. There is a sort of nice continuity in everything that we've read so far. They're not identical, but as you look at the stories we've read so far, stylistically across the page, they tend to look about the same. All of a sudden, when we come to Hills Like White Elephants, this is a story that is 95% dialogue. And short, terse, snappy dialogue, not long, stilted, formal dialogue. And this is what the introductory material in your book points out on 1031. They call his style modern, speeded up, and streamlined. And that's Hemingway. There is almost no exposition here. That is commentary by the narrator. What we have from the narrator is almost pure description, which is something we'll look at because that's very interesting, because usually we rely on the narrator for some kind of commentary, some kind of perspective, so that we know how we're supposed to feel about particular characters and particular situations. We don't get any of that from the narrator in this story. The narrator in this story simply tells us what is happening. Every bit of interpretation that we do based on the dialogue. And the really interesting thing about the dialogue is we have absolutely no context for the dialogue, so it's pure interpretation. How well you can read between the lines, which has led to a lot of different interpretations of the story. There are a number of good examples of symbolism here. What's interesting about the symbolism is most of it, none of it's explained. Again, there's no exposition, so none of it's explained. And a lot of it is introduced to us through the dialogue. And so I'll try to explain that a little bit, how that works, right? But clearly, this doesn't look on the page like anything we've read before. We've seen dialogue, but usually it's broken up by periods of narrative exposition. And here we don't have that. If we just look at the way the story starts, there's one paragraph. And if you look at this, it is purely descriptive. That is, there is nothing here except a description. The hills across the valley of the Ebro were long and white. On this side there was no shade and no trees, and the station was between two lines of rails in the sun. Close against the side of the station there was the warm shadow of the building, and a curtain made of strings of bamboo beads hung across the open door into the bar to keep out flies. The American and the girl with him sat at a table in the shade outside the building. It was very hot, and the express from the Barcelona would come in 40 minutes. It stopped at this junction for 2 minutes and went on to Madrid. Now let's just think about that for a minute. It's a description of the setting. This is nothing unusual. We've seen this. But if we flip back and look, for example, at Jack London, there is no indication of significance here of any kind. There's no commentary from the narrator on this setting. There's no indication of any significance provided to this setting. Nothing romanticized about the setting. There's no use of figurative language of any kind here. It's pure descriptive imagery. If we think about Vonnegut, Shapes of Stories, there's no good news or bad news here. This is very interesting. It's a completely new approach. It's almost stage directions like you would see in a play. Here's what the scene looks like. And really, then it's dialogue, with the exception of a couple of very small paragraphs. The top of 1033, the woman brought 2 glasses of beer and 2 felt pads. She put the felt pads and the beer glasses on the table. She looked at the man and the girl. The girl was looking off at the line of hills. They were white in the sun, and the country was brown and dry. Again, pure description. The waitress doesn't even contemplate the situation. At the bottom of 1034, the girl stood up and walked to the end of the station. Across, on the other side, were fields of grain and trees along the banks of the Ebro. Far away, beyond the river, were mountains. The shadow of a cloud moved across the field of grain, and she saw the river through the trees. There is no exposition here. We expect it. She's clearly thinking about something deep, and what we expect here is that she gets up, she looks at the landscape, and there's some kind of a connection, and we're going to get to see the connection. She thought about it. She felt this. She did none of that. Pure description. And then again, at the bottom of 1035, right before the end of the story, we have this interesting paragraph. The narrator telling us, he picked up the 2 heavy bags and carried them around the station to the other tracks. He looked up the tracks but could not see the train. Coming back, he walked through the bar room where people waiting for the train were drinking. He drank an anise at the bar and looked at the people. So far, purely descriptive. This is the one piece of exposition we get. They were all waiting reasonably for the train. Reasonably. See, that's the commentary that we've been looking for. That's the exposition we've been looking for. This is the first time we get it. And I'll explain it here in a minute what's so interesting about this. He went out through the bead curtain. She was sitting at the table and smiled at him. It's a fleeting moment. It's one word, reasonably. What's interesting about this is it doesn't come from the narrator. It's from the perspective of the man. Right? The paragraph there is the narrator telling us what the man sees. So far, anytime we've done this, whether it's been the waitress or the girl, we don't get any kind of indication about their thoughts, the connections that they're making between the setting and themselves, right, in the situation. We only get this one word, and it's from him, reasonably, which lets us know he thinks she's being unreasonable. But it's important because it's him, it's not the narrator. That's the only point. That's the only clue we get, is that whatever they're talking about, he thinks she's being unreasonable. But what are they talking about? Whatever it is, they won't name it. We see on 1034, there's an operation mentioned. But then he immediately says it's not an operation at all. It's just to let the air in. I don't want to talk too much about it and spoil it for you, but I wanted to point out the difference in the style here, the lack of commentary or exposition by the narrator. When you're looking for symbols in the story, remember, the symbol has to be something that has a literal purpose in the story. So clearly, the hills, which are like white elephants, which is a simile, right? The hills themselves are symbolic. Their whiteness. Why white? Why white? But there are other things in the story that may be symbolic. A good thing to think about when you're looking for symbols. There are some obvious places to start. Names can be heavily symbolic. The girl does have a name, at least a nickname. We don't know if it's her actual name or a nickname. So look for that. Color, as we mentioned with the white elephants. It's not hills like elephants, it's hills like white elephants. White signifies something. So color. Numbers can be highly significant. Not just numbers given necessarily, but things that are repeated. So if there's a repetition of a particular piece of dialogue a certain number of times, or if they have to spend a certain amount of time doing something. So those are things to watch for sometimes, right? So names, colors, numbers. Animals carry significance, right? We attribute qualities and characteristics to certain kinds of animals. Right. So, for example, rats tend to signify something different than owls. Right. Some of this has to do with context. Some of it has to do with culture. Um, so you have to keep in mind it's American story. Uh, so, uh, you know. But my suggestion is, also when you're looking at the story, what do they keep coming back to? Are there certain things, certain objects, certain items that continue to catch their attention, or that the narrator mentions multiple times? Because it's a very short story. So if something shows up again and again and again, if we're being directed to focus on something, then it might have symbolic significance. So that would be the way that I would approach that. Now remember, the difference between symbolism and allegory in general is that allegory has this very specific meaning that's applied over the duration of the story, whereas the symbol requires a certain amount of sort of contextual interpretation. So it's an object or something that represents something other than itself, but what it represents may change from context to context. So it's very specific to the story here, right? And I think there are a number of things to look for. What's very nice, it's a very short story, and looking for the symbolism will help you interpret the story. Okay? And I would resist the urge to look online for interpretations of the story because you'll find some, and Whether they are reasonable or not is irrelevant. Having someone sort of tell you what the story means before you take the time to try to figure it out for yourself will very much ruin the experience of reading the story for you. So I look forward to seeing what sort of symbols you identify besides the hills like white elephants. Although I'd be interested in knowing how you interpret that symbol.